Hello and welcome to UiPath Essentials Training, Excel and Data Tables. In this tutorial, you'll learn the basics of working with Excel files and spreadsheet data. I'll show you how to open files, read cells or ranges, output data, and iterate through a table to evaluate each row and take decisions. Along the way, you'll pick up a few other tips and tricks and subtle differences between several ways of solving a problem. You should already be familiar with the UiPath interface and workflow, passing variables between actions and if-else decisions, as we'll use these concepts throughout this tutorial. So, if you're ready, let's begin. We'll start off with the simplest workflow, opening a sample Excel file, printing its contents, and saving it into a new file. Easy enough. Most of the actions we're interested in are found here under App Integration, Excel. As always, we'll begin with a new sequence. When working with Excel files, the first activity will always be the Excel application scope. It's a container, and all the other Excel activities must go inside it. Let's choose a sample Excel file. The Browse button by default opens in the location of the current project, and paths are relative to this location. The workbook path is automatically filled out, but please note that it is a variable that can be dynamically changed if required. Another important aspect of this activity is this visible checkbox. It tells UiPath to either read the file using Microsoft Excel, or, if it's unchecked, the read operation will be performed internally, directly on the file. The difference between the two is that the default visible option requires Excel to be installed, and all actions will be performed through it. So you'll be able to see in real time what's going on, which can be useful for debugging or just checking the progress of the workflow. If the visible option is unchecked, you do not need Microsoft Excel to be installed on the system, and the whole process happens in the background, and that's what we'll use for the moment. Next, we'll add a read range action. It reads a portion of the Excel file and stores it in a data table where different operations can be performed on it. Now, what's the difference between a workbook and a data table, you ask? Well, a workbook is just a reference to an Excel file. It can have all types of data: formatting, sheets, layouts, merged cells, and multiple data tables. On the other hand, a data table is just the simplest type of spreadsheet data: rows and columns with optional headers. This simplified format is useful for further processing, as we'll see later. So, we'll create the output data table, let's say data table 1. The range parameter is empty by default, which means the whole sheet will be read, but we can specify a range as 2 colon-separated cells. Moving on, let's display it. We'll first add an output data table action. Despite its name, the output data table does not print its content to the output pane. It just converts it to a string that we can display properly. Create a new output string, and for the input data table, choose the output of the read range action DT1. Then drop in a message box to display it. Just fill out the text variable with the one created previously, so we can test everything out. And here's our table. Now all we have to do is save it to a new file, and because it's a different file, we need a brand new Excel application scope. For the path, we'll specify the name of the file we want to write to. We'll call it results. If there is no such file, it will be created on the fly, and inside it, a write range action. It's very similar to the read range action, except it needs the data table to write to the file. Oh. Well, it looks like it doesn't recognize it. We probably need to change the scope of the data table to this whole sequence: read, write, Excel. There. It's worth mentioning that if there is any data in the Excel file, write range overwrites it, similar to a paste command in Excel, starting from the obvious starting cell. Let's see. The message with the data table, and we should see the results file appearing here too. And there it is. You may have noticed that the information written in this file has headers. If you want to exclude them, you'll want to use the Add Headers option, both in the read action, where it signifies that the first row is indeed a header, and in the write range, where you'll deselect it if you want just the data. We'll delete the old results file and run. And no more headers. Now that we have a basic working project, let's see some other actions useful in working with Excel and data tables. Append range is similar to write range, except it adds data after all currently existing data without overwriting. And just like its sister activity, it takes a data table as input parameter. We could read from another Excel file, but we'll try something else. We'll make a new one. The data table actions can be found here under Programming, Data Table. To make a new one, we'll drag in a build data table. It has a simple user interface for customizing your table. It starts off with a default 2 rows and 2 columns layout, but we'll delete them to start fresh. Columns also have types, and we have all the range of visualbasic.net at our disposal. For now, we'll just leave it as string. We'll add a few more rows of data. And we're done. We just need to give this new data table a name. Let's say new data table. And pass it to append range. We'll delete the old result. And here are the 3 new appended rows. As you can see, the number of columns in the appended data table isn't really important, but it is advisable to keep the database well organized. Let's see what else you can do. If you wanted, you could also sort this listing using the sort table activity. The column name is pretty obvious. It's the column we want to sort by. We'll use the first column, called year. The table name parameter is different. It requires a table defined in Excel. So open the results file and delete the existing content. Then select the first 3 columns and go to Insert, Table, and hit OK. And this is the table name parameter that you need, that you can change if you need to. Save and close this down, and back in UiPath, paste the name of the table here. And the last thing to do is make sure the headers are included in the write action, because they're required for sorting. And here's our sorted table, with the headers we enabled in the write range action. 2 more valuable actions are read and write cell. You can probably guess how they work, but let's see a quick example anyway. We'll start with a new sequence and the usual Excel application scope, opening the same Excel file as earlier. Inside it, add the read cell and write cell actions from the activities panel. We'll read from the C3 cell. And write in the E5 cell, both in the same file. And take the output from the read cell and pass it to the write value action. Like so. Looks like it worked. Another action that you might find useful is the select range. All it does is select the individual cells found in the specified range. Let's say from A1 to F4. On its own, the select range doesn't have a direct effect, but after selecting something, you can use it to delete, copy, move, or do any other operations directly in Microsoft Excel. Okay, let's quickly review what we learned, because next up we'll take it a step further. Excel application scope is a container for read and write actions that are performed on a certain Excel file. Read range reads a portion of an Excel file and outputs a data table. Output data table converts a data table into string, usually for displaying. And write range writes a data table into an Excel file. These are just the main ones. There are a few more actions found under App Integration, Excel. Things like read and write cell, append, select range, and others I'm sure you'll discover on your own. Great. Now that we have the basics down, let's try a more practical example. We have here a sample public employees database with columns for name, age, work domain, current job, and salary. It has around 300 entries. We'll take a look at how to extract, analyze, and filter relevant information that you could then insert into your own accounting software, or mailing server, Citrix, or whatever else you may need. We'll start with the usual approach, an Excel application scope, read range, and so on. But this time, we'll try it in a flowchart mode so you can visualize it better. So, set up the Excel application range, and add a read range to get the Excel file into a data table called DT1. Make sure the scope for the data table is set to the parent flowchart. We called it filtered database. Next, we'll add the important bit, the for each row action. We'll use it to iterate through the whole data table, row by row, and analyze each to decide if we want to copy it to a new database. Please note that there are two similar for each actions. The one we'll use is exclusively for data tables, and the other is a generic one that can be used for various types of lists and arrays. Inside our for each action, we need to tell it which data table we want to iterate through. In our case, DT1. To look at each value individually, we'll add a getRowItem activity. It outputs the value of a specific cell in the current row. To indicate which cell we want, we can use an index, like for example, the fourth cell or a column name, if we have headers, which we do. The latter is usually preferred because it allows for more flexibility. If the Excel file is modified with added or removed columns, for example, the workflow won't break because the names of the columns will indicate the correct data. We'll get the name of the employee and print it out. It can't find the column name, most likely because we forgot to include them in the read range activity. Let's see. Yep, here it is. Okay, so far so good. We have the names. Since we want to filter based on the data in the table, we need to get the rest of the data too and analyze it. In the for each loop, we'll duplicate the getRowItem to get age and income. We'll just make new variables for them and indicate the appropriate columns. And to make some decisions based on this data, we'll put in an if action that you learned about in a previous training, control flow. Now let's see, who is younger than 30 and with an income of more than 100k? And let's display its name. It looks like we have a few early achievers on our list. If you want to, you could print the rest of the data in the same right line. And add a bit of separation. I'd just like to stop and point out that this whole workflow, while fairly simple, is pretty powerful because this right line is just a placeholder. It's the place in the workflow where you would normally add real-world functionality to your project. Using other UiPath features, you could insert this data into a web form, inventory, your own custom app, Citrix, and so on. Or you could filter, sort, or otherwise process the data. The possibilities are endless. But so far, we've only printed the data. Now let's see how we can save all of it into a new data table for exporting. We'll start by going up one level to the main workflow in the Excel application scope, add a build data table action right after the read range. We'll use it to store the filtered data table. Inside it, delete the existing columns and create 3 new ones for name, age, and income. We just need to give this new data table a name. Let's say new data table, and make if visible from the parent flowchart. Now, here's the important bit. Inside the for each action, instead of the write line action, we'll use an add data row. The two important parameters here are the name of the data table to add into, in our case, new data table, and the data to add, in the form of an array. The array is specified as a comma-separated list, enclosed in braces, or curly brackets. We'll use the three variables that we read here with getRowItem, name, age, and income. So now, for each row in the file, the program will read the age and income, and if the condition is met, it will add the data to the empty data table, new data table, created earlier. And that's it. We'll just save the data table into a new file with an Excel application scope and add a write range the same way we saw earlier. And here's our results file with the filtered results. This concludes our essentials training for Excel and data tables. For a more in-depth look at this topic, please see our advanced training in this series. We'll see you soon.